I am Chris. Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. This is the title of the summary or talk I'm going to give today, which is on the pleasures of the Asiatic. And I'm going to talk about this game, Paradise Killer. I should say something about myself first. I'm at UBC, University of British Columbia, at the Social Justice Institute. I'm on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coast Salish nations. Yeah, that's me. I don't know how many of you have played this game, Paradise Killer. The only thing you need to know about it for now is that it has the best theme song of any video game ever. Prove me wrong. We can play that maybe during the break to see if anyone agrees. I'm going to start by just talking about some of the main ideas from my book, Open World Empire, that came out in April 2020. It's almost 2 years ago now. For those who haven't read it, I'm just going to summarize some of the foundational kind of ideas that then we can that lead to some of the more recent work I'm doing. And pleasure is a big part of this book. And so I'm really grateful to be here and to be in conversation with everyone, with Kishona, with Bo, with Aaron, and with Phelan. So thank you all for arranging this and organizing it. I'm just going to go through the very quick rundown of the book and some of the main claims. So the first is that games illuminate and refract the open world empire, which, to put it as short as possible, is basically like the kind of networked empire of information technology and the kind of routes of exploitation and extraction that are often behind the scenes of a kind of nationalist form of empire. In doing so, games then appear Asiatic to the West, resembling hybrid forms of imperial collaboration and influence. So I'll talk more about that second point in a bit. But then the basic point of a lot of that is to say that if we want to play games in a way that exposes these things, I encourage the reader to play them erotically or to think through erotics. And so I'm using erotics here as basically the way a lot of people do, is a kind of undefined term that just allowed us to think about pleasures and desires and the wider scene and networks that those pleasures and desires are embedded in. So again, the book is very focused on pleasures. I'm very happy to be part of this event in doing that. Things are going to pop up. I don't know. But I did want to expand on that second point, Asiatic, because I'm going to talk about Asiatic quite a bit in reference to this game called Paradise Killer. But in the book Open World Empire, I define it as a style or form recognized as Asianish, but that remains adaptable, fluid, and outside of the authentic/inauthentic binary. The Asiatic does not strive for realness, but plays upon the real. And so I'm thinking through texts like Techno-Orientalism and more recently Anne Chang's Ornamentalism and the work of Lisa Nakamura and Wendy Chun to think about how we can talk about games without kind of just defaulting into, especially in terms of representations of Asians and Asian Americans, without just defaulting into a kind of Techno-Orientalist framework. Which then is just a difficult kind of framework to work in for games because games are so hybridized and so many innovations, genres, styles come from Asian contexts. And so I just found talking to like Asian American studies scholars about games was really, really hard. To this day, my colleague Tara Fickle and I are both the only ones who organize panels on video games at the big Asian American Studies conference. There seems to be a complete like disavowal or dismissal of games as just being kind of racist and techno-orientalist. And of course, growing up playing video games, that never made much sense to me. And so Asiatic was a kind of term that I noticed people were using to talk about the kind of Asianness in games and how games were racialized as within a kind of Asian context. And then looking, of course, more into it, we can see how the kind of styles and forms that emerge from games are also racialized, at least to Westerners in Asian ways. And so I'm thinking of like the freemium kind of gameplay loops, the way that consoles and Nintendo kind of stand in for games writ large, and the ways that we have like racialized main characters like Barrett from Final Fantasy VII, who we can kind of read as an African-American kind of construct, but is routed through a Japanese imaginary, right? And that route, I think, is really important when it comes to understanding the effects of those characters. So that's basically just kind of the like really like 5-minute overview of some of the arguments from the book that I think are important to carry on with us to this event. And I'm going to now try and shift a bit to just think about pleasure in the book and how I talk about pleasure in games. There's a lot of different ways we can talk about pleasure in games, just the kind of way that it's informally used to talk about fun and the joy. Like, why do you play games? Oh, because it's fun, right? Which is a kind of frivolous reason, but one that we hear a lot. And nothing's wrong with frivolity. There's also the kind of pleasures of things like of delight in erotic pleasures, like getting a headshot in a game. This is Amanda Phillips's pretty groundbreaking essay on the headshot. I'm also thinking of like Richard Dyer and Ian Bokos' considerations of the ideological form of pleasure and how pleasure reinforces. And this is kind of, you know, where problematic kind of comes in as a term. Problematic as in reinforcing particular biases and historical structures, that pleasure has, of course, a role in doing that. We can also think of pleasure through the kind of enchantment or immersion that Bernard Suits and Janet Murray talk about. They tend to have an anxiety about this as being sexual in any way and seem to define it outside of sex and erotics. And then the personal pleasures of games that are kind of scary in some ways, right? The ways that trolling emerges through games and then becomes taken up in larger discourses. However, I'm not going to really focus on any of these. I'm going to talk more about this, the kind of framework that I use in the book that I continue to use, which is based a bit more in the queer theoretical understandings of pleasure. And so I'll just kind of quickly go through each one as I feel they're relevant to what I really want to talk about, which is this fun video game called Paradise Killer. But the first thing to kind of think about is the ways that for Foucault, there's figures of pleasure. There's the masturbating child, the homosexual adult. So these are figures that are then kind of monsterized and in need of discipline. Or if we update our thinking a bit, they're also like terrorized or are part of a kind of terrorist construct. I argue that video gamers, at least the kind of very stereotypical white male image of gamers, is also a kind of figure of pleasure that must be disciplined. And so I talk about that a bit in the book. Another way to think about pleasure is through history of sexuality and Sedgwick's touching feeling, and thinking about critique itself as serving a kind of pleasure, right? The pleasures of power and knowledge. So the pleasures of being able to like dictate what kind of identities people are, and being able to then use those to think about groups in different populations. And Foucault compares this to what he calls an ars erotica, which I'm not going to talk about besides saying that, but that's interesting to me. And so we can think about this other form of thinking about pleasure as one that takes upon methods of discipline and control through the production of knowledge. Right, so that the more we know about a certain population, the more hardened or solidified we think about that population as a race, as a class, as gendered, and so on. The more that can also give a kind of pleasure to us, one of feeling elevated, of feeling like we are somehow objective in being able to make those claims. The third type of pleasure is the pleasures of politics or biopolitics. And Sedgwick and Roland Barthes really talk a lot about this. For Barthes, this is just, when he uses the words pleasure, that's exactly what he means, is this kind of pleasure of reinforcing the self, empowering the self, or as we might think of in a more neoliberal context of kind of self-optimization, right? And of course, the other side to this is that it necessitates the like less than human, the parahuman or the non-human peoples who don't really count and measure up in this context, right? So the biopolitical is always kind of wedded to the necropolitical, I guess is the more jargony kind of way to put that. But that this is also a very pleasurable experience, right? That Barthes kind of calls this a drift. And so we can think about it through immersion, through other forms of gaming, right, that kind of puts you into this drifting atmosphere. And so for Barthes, this could then be disrupted by certain kind of erotic bliss rather than pleasures. So that's just a bit of the kind of theoretical framework I'm thinking through. I'm going to use this framework to then analyze Paradise Killer and the kind of pleasures that this game is about, and what those pleasures mean for us in game studies, and for us, the the wider, bigger us. Paradise Killer is a game about a detective. You are playing a detective in an open world setting. Yes, it's kind of an open world game, like Open World Empire, I guess. And there's a dizzyingly diverse cast of characters who are queer in different ways, who are campy and fun and silly, and sometimes, and they're all immortal, by the way. The characters you see on screen, they're immortal. They live on an island, fun, funky Miami Beach kind of like island. And something bad has happened. Someone has killed their leaders, the council, and you have to find out who the killer is. So you are the detective looking for the killer of this, and it could be any one of these immortal folks. So that's the kind of brief, weird rundown of the game. It came out in 2020. I'm going to argue that Paradise Killer is about pleasure and about how we experience pleasure. And a lot of this is coming from, again, ideas from the book. And so one of the things that we see constantly throughout this game is actually from the United Kingdom. It's a British game, but it's the name of the company is Kaizen, which is a Japanese term that's used in business contexts to be like, just keep improving, keep going. So that's already kind of an interesting thing. But then if we actually play the game itself, we notice that a lot of the art styles are very kind of quote unquote Asiatic, right? The city pop music that's layered throughout, the kind of vaporwave aesthetic, lo-fi beats. The architecture is quite ostensibly taken from East Asian contexts. It looks very similar to places I lived in South Korea and China and in Hong Kong, though I think it's probably particularly taken from Japanese architecture. The names of a lot of those characters that you saw before, they have Asian names, even though their background is not necessarily Asian. It takes a lot from the genres of open world, coming not from GTA and Western companies, but from Yu Suzuki's Shenmue game, from Suda51's Flower, Sun and Rain. So it's taking from a more Asian or Japanese Tokyo innovative context of where the open world games come from. And then visual novels are also very much associated with Japan. So it's taking all of these kind of Asiatic forms that we might feel nostalgic with and recognize. Nostalgia is also heavy in the game. There are cassette tapes everywhere, for example, and things like that. It also seems to reproduce this trope of ornamentalism, as Anne Chang calls it, as a lot of games do. So I'm not really trying to take it to task for doing this. But in the sense that all the characters that you see before you, none that we can verify are from any Asian context. You can actually look at their backgrounds in the game and figure out where they're all from, what country they came from, and so on. None of them came from East Asia as far as we can verify. Yet they mostly have Asian names. They live in these like Asian looking kind of areas. And so this would be a kind of case of ornamentalism for Anne Chang, I would guess, where Asia is kind of there as ornament, right? It's there as style, it's there as form, but it erases the bodies. Again, not taking it to task so much for doing that, because that is just a thing games tend to do. The other types of pleasure that we see frequently throughout the game is those of power and knowledge. Like, you are a detective, like that's what you do. And you have access to these weirdly like supernatural forms of objectivity so that you can verify like actual facts. You're writing down everything. There's actually a population tab, which is very biopolitical to me. Your knowledge also has very direct consequences. So there's basically like 3 different genres in the game. There's the open world genre, there's the visual novel genre, and then there's the courtroom genre that you can start at any moment in the game. And you basically take all the information you've gathered and you use it to convince the judge that whoever you want to execute deserves to be executed. And you, as the kind of arbiter of knowledge, and then have the ability to take that knowledge and use it however you want in order to create your own truth. Right? So there's a very direct line between how knowledge is gained and then the power that comes from that knowledge. And I have to say, it's a really fun, pleasurable experience, right? Gaining the knowledge, finding out all these facts, and then using it to execute people you don't like is a very pleasurable experience throughout this game. The last one is the pleasures of politics or biopolitics. And so this is something I've become more interested in a kind of post-Gamergate world of video games, and how a lot of the political pleasures that come from games are things that are not, they're not shaped not for us, I guess is one way to put it, or that they're not aimed directly for us, but they're aimed at certain segments of what things that we might ally with. So for example, the kind of queerness, the soft, cute styles, the diversity in the game. A lot of these are aimed at a more mature audience, a more quote unquote woke leftist kind of audience. And so the kind of easy drift of politics, of empowerment and so on, works through the political schema of the game, right? Including the way that visual novels, as I argue in other work, at least in North America, are seen as one of the most progressive genres of video games. Paradise Killer is taking all of that, right, to kind of reinforce a lot of the, and make us feel comfortable, right, by reinforcing the kind of forms of the self and values that we have, right? So all of these lead to different forms of pleasure, and playing the game is certainly very pleasurable, but there's also some really dark and weird happening throughout the game. So what's really going on in Paradise Killer is a lot. And so I actually wrote it out here so you can all see it, because I'm very proud of this paragraph. It took a long time to figure out how to put the entire plot into one paragraph. So I'm just going to read it. So this is the plot. Ancient gods once ruled the world and controlled mankind until mankind rose against them. This is very Lovecraftian here. Then, sometime around 1000 AD, the Syndicate, a group of radicals who still worshipped these gods, became immortal, and in an effort to entice the gods back to Earth, created islands in an alternative reality, then kidnapped and enslaved people from the real world, citizens, and forced them into psychic worshiping rituals. However, as such worship can invite supernatural forces one by one, each island was infected or invaded by demons, and each had to be ritualistically sacrificed. So all the people have to be killed, then replaced by another island where they take more people, kidnap them, enslave them, kill them again. Paradise Killer takes place on island number 24. All of its characters, besides Henry, which I'll talk about in a bit, who's the only citizen in the game, are part of this very evil lunatic cult of the Syndicate. So it's very Lovecraftian in some of its imagining. It doesn't leave any of the violence of Lovecraft behind. And Lovecraft, of course, was quite racist, and especially anti-Asian, but was racist all around. And the game is taking a lot of the violence embedded in Lovecraftian horror into a kind of, and washing it in kind of Asiatic pink. So you might then be asking, at what point in the game can you then do something about this? At what point is the big reveal, and then you can actually like fight back against the system? And the interesting thing about this game is there is no big reveal, right? It's just there. Like, this story is just all around you. Like, people talk about it, but nobody actually really cares about it or sees it as a very important thing, including you, the main character. It doesn't actually matter when it comes to solving the crime either. None of the killers are motivated by the enormous injustice of this place existing in the first place, right? And what tends to happen is you, the player, also don't really care. You ignore or obscure all of those injustices because the pleasures that are in front of you are just so interesting. And again, they verify your own values constantly. You do find things like you're picking up different relics and you find absurd message stones where children have written their wishes for what happens in the next life right before they're killed, and things like that. But you can't really react to it or think about it. It's just there. And again, probably wouldn't even notice it. You'd have to actually go and read those relics, which you don't actually have to do. There's also nothing you can do about it in the game. You can't change anything. You can't get anyone to think critically about what's happening. Again, it's just kind of there. So I played the game and I was just very unsettled by this. I kept expecting moments where I could do something about this injustice. And it was kind of horrifying. It was a horror game for me. The pleasure stopped at some point because I was horrified at just how nobody cared about what was happening. And then I realized how true that is to real life in a lot of ways. And I was like, okay, I kind of get what's going on. But I also then really wanted to know who these citizens are. Where do they come from? I noticed I only have a minute left, so I'm gonna wrap up a bit. But long story short, they're Asian. The Asiatic contexts in the game are very much focused on where the citizens live, where the enslaved people live. So you might take pleasure in being in this Asiatic context and in the culture and the songs and the music and everything, only to later realize that they're all there for the enslaved people, right? Which suggests a kind of yellow peril narrative, right? So the game is actually about kidnapping, enslaving, and killing Asian people. It's not actually a celebration of the cutesy, queer, diverse Asiatic worlds. It's actually a condemnation in many ways of those worlds. And it's not a far leap, of course, to then think about the ways that information technology and the very devices that allow us to talk to each other right now and to play these games also take place within a context of exploited, dehumanized Asian labor, right? That's where the toxic chemicals of e-waste go. This has been written about, again, so many times by so many people that it's exhausting at this point to continue to talk about, which is exactly how it feels in the game, right? That you are sometimes exhausted by it and you just want to keep playing and have your fun. So to conclude, this is my last slide. The game tells us a lot about how pleasures are working for us. It's telling us about pleasure in a kind of social racial justice context, right? The pleasures that can emerge while still allowing us to reproduce the kind of injustices that condition these pleasures. So it actually challenges us to think through not just our values, but how the practices of those values might impact other people, right? It's about how the pleasures of biopolitics are always wedded in some ways to the obscuration of the necropolitical worlds that are linked directly to us. And finally, it bodes not so great for us in that an Asiatic future does not really bode well for the vast majority of Asian people and hasn't thus far. Okay, thank you, Heart Shape, and may you reach the moon.
You can go ahead, Sarah.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks, Phelan, for the opportunity to collaborate with you on this amazing symposium. Thanks to all of our panelists for being here today. And I have the great honor of introducing our next speaker, Aaron Trammell. Aaron Trammell is an assistant professor of informatics and core faculty in visual studies at the University of California, Irvine. He writes about how play is a racialized project and considers its roots in geek and hobbyist communities over the course of the 20th century. His book, Repairing Play, A Theory of Play that Centers BIPOC People, is forthcoming via the MIT Press in 2023. And his book, Hobbyists, A History of White Supremacy in Hobby Games, is forthcoming via NYU Press, also in 2023. That's going to be a giant year for you. He is a co-founder and the editor-in-chief of the journal Analog Game Studies and co-founder and multimedia editor of Sounding Out. And Aaron, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. On a personal note, it's really awesome to be introduced by you because I remember really starting to think through a lot of this stuff critically at, I think it was the York and Ryerson Play Power Symposium where you keynoted. So thank you for the really kind introduction. Anyways, I'll jump straight to it. Today's talk is Play's Arrest. My goal in this talk is to work towards inverting some of the typical tropes through which we understand play, specifically to get into some of the work I do in repairing play, wherein I argue that play, we might have a definition of play that's a phenomenology based in BIPOC experience as opposed to white experience. And I think one of the nexus that I'll be talking kind of through this entire presentation, one of the reasons this is impactful, is it's also a conversation about access to leisure and who has access to leisure and what that potential politics means. One thing I will say is I'm going to ask the room to do some listening. So that might get awkward at times, but we're just going to be listening to some things. I've got no visuals in this entire presentation besides words. So yeah, we might just listen to a song. And I think that's important, right? Because unseating the visual is also sort of unseating the sort of regime of representation that posits anti-Blackness as a sort of positive. So that's deliberate. Anyways, that said,
I hear something saying, that's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. That's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. All day long. you know that's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. That's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. All day long they work so hard till the sun is going down. Working on the highways and byways and wearing a frown. You hear them moaning their lives away, then you hear somebody say, that's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. That's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. Can't you hear them saying, I'm going home one of these days. I'm going home, see my woman, whom I love so dear. But meanwhile, I got to work right here. That's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. That's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. All day long they're saying, my work is so hard, give me water, I'm thirsty, my work is so hard,
So that's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. This was a civil rights protest song in the 1960s. It's one that's shrouded in many ways, like Sam Cooke's career, in a sort of ambivalence about the degree to which his Blackness was legible as something, as a focus of violence, or if himself as a Black person was a committer of violence. Sam Cooke was killed at a motel after a torrid night where some white folks argued that he was sexually harassing them. At the same time, his family contests this, and the evidence didn't line up in the police department. And this is it, right? This is the core. This is the ambivalence of play, of not knowing. And I kind of wanted to start with Chain Gang because I think it's interesting how the civil rights song that, you know, has all these allusions to slave songs, to the Black experience, has kind of can kind of be seen as a contested object. The other thing is in the lyrics of the song, right? Like thinking about what it means to be working in this sense, not playing, wearing a frown, right? It has these echoes of Black sadness, brown feeling, like Cornel West and Jose Esteban Munoz would put it, right? These affects that the people working were experiencing and trying to experiment in explaining these affects via song. So this is a talk about play. And when we talk about play, right, one of the words I would use for describing the pleasure of play is thinking through captivation. And I think that in some sense, right, this is like the state of being held captive. It's an allusion in some ways also to what Hortense Spillers talks about when she talks about what Blackness is, fantasy in the hold. The common point of history, which is the hold of slave ships that people from Africa, people from all places in the global South were exported to during the period of colonization. And so when I talk about Blackness, I'm talking about it in this sort of like global sense that tries to invoke a sense of solidarity between Black peoples, reaches to a moment where a past has been lost and to a common future. So captivation is also a sort of pleasure, right? It's also how we know play is fun. It's also how we know play through flow theory and stuff like that. So I think this is a really useful word to think through play through, specifically because of its flip side, which is capture. And so if we want to talk about play's arrest, what play does, the phenomenology of play and how play disciplines, I think we should also be talking about capture, right? And this is to look in the news for the past 2 years, the past 10 years, the past 50 years, the past 100 years, to think about what the experience of BIPOC people are worldwide. Capture is a world, right? Capture and arrest are things that happen to Black people disproportionately than to white people. And so putting capture out there as a word, that might be what play is doing. When we talk about the magic circle of play, right? through a Eurocentric lens, we see it as this moment of freedom, right? It's not going into a contained space. It's going to have free action where you can do anything you want, like it's a space of fantasia. But what if we invert that? What if we look at that sense of play not as freedom within the circle, but as capture within the circle, where something's happening, we're being disciplined by what's happening during play. And in some ways, this is where my work in the Torture Play article, really, I would just call back to it if you haven't read it yet. The big argument I make there is that to understand play through a lens that's more inclusive of the BIPOC experience, thinking about it as a subject relationship, as a voluntary thing between two consenting people, I don't think that is necessarily something that I don't think that is necessarily what the theory on play says it is. Just think of a playground getting bullied, being shoved into the sand, right? That's not a consenting relationship. And I also think that when we start broadening the scope of what that could mean in terms of what play does, it actually starts to give us more tonalities to play with as authors, as people who think about and design games. Tonalities that dip into trauma, dip into torture, dip into this sort of space of experience that Black people have had put on them, and that white people have been able to evade through the sort of like captivation of play, of pleasurable play. And so I think bringing in these other affects is a really important part of theorizing play. And so, you know, and to get there, right, this deals with what a lot of the play canon, you know, people like Johann Huizinga, Roger Caillois, Jean Piaget, right, these like European scholars would put in their work as civilization, which is a work that fortunately the field has moved away from. But, you know, as they theorize this idea of play, they juxtapose sort of like pleasurable European play against savage and barbaric play. They use words like savage to discuss this sort of work, the play of people in indigenous cultures and Black cultures. And so, you know, I think this word civilization is a sort of problematic hot button word that gets theorized. Play is seen as productive of civilization, according to Johann Huizinga, right? And I think this is a sort of problematic way to think through play, because it is really establishing that play is actually about maintaining white supremacy in a variety of ways. And so I really want to contest that. And to contest that, I think we need to think through different kinds of play and different ways to understand play, right? Which is why I'm using song. I'm thinking through play through these different modalities than just games. Additionally, and I think this is perhaps the thing that, if you're on this panel, might be perhaps the most controversial and also the least controversial thing also, right? Game studies often theorizes play through pleasure, right? And in that way, I think that games, as long as they're theorized as fun, as pleasurable experiences, and not other experiences that one can have, I think we do have a white supremacist space of games and play. And thus, right, it's a conversation about access to leisure. When back in the days of Marx, when the working week was theorized, it was leisure, you know, at the 40-hour work week comes as a way to provide leisure to workers of the world. But this is not an inclusive definition of worker, and it's not an inclusive definition of leisure. And until we have a sort of play that offers leisure to all, I think that we do still have the trappings of white supremacy in a lot of the games we play. And so what's the path forward? So I want to look to Black radical aesthetics as theorized by people like Fred Moten and Stefano Harney as a possible path forward. When looking at Black radical aesthetics, right, there are ways to think through what Black art, what Black expression, what these Black and BIPOC-centered modes of aesthetics bring to the table that is not at the table or not at the fore of the table when we get into the sort of like typical aesthetics of games, right? Aesthetics of pleasure, aesthetics of fun. For example, the work of Frederick Douglass, right? He writes about Aunt Hester's Tears, which is thinking about the slave songs and his work to popularize abolitionism in the 19th century. And here he talks about crying when he listens to slave songs, how they move him, how they're spiritually moving. And this was a way to make legible to white audiences what it meant to basically to have to be in the position of bondage in the 19th century. And I think that's really important, right? That sort of like moment of thinking through the aesthetics of what understanding this feeling can be, what understanding the set of affects might be as we think through what games of play are. And again, right, like music. So here's another piece that Fred Moten theorizes in his essay in the break. I'm gonna have to leave the screen share, not the screen share, but the, I guess the screen share for just a second because I have to jump forward because we're low on time. So just asking to listen again. This is Max Roach's triptych prayer protest piece, and this is Abby Lincoln singing. All right, well, I got the word I can play the whole thing. All right, this is a long clip, so let's listen. Enjoy. Sorry. So that's what Fred Moten describes as the break. It's a space of expression that is itself the void of placelessness. It's a space which is difficult to represent and difficult to understand, and it tunes into the sort of representational space, the illegibility of what it means to be Black, what it means to be other in a white nation, right? It's the unknowable and it's the unspeakable. And, you know, when he writes about this song specifically, he's got this really difficult to read and beautiful passage where he talks about what it means to be listening in on this session from the other side of the wall. What do the screams that Abby Lincoln is making, what do these sounds that she's making connote to the other people in the wall, people who might be listening in from the other room, the white folks who might be listening into the other room, right? These are arresting screams. It's difficult. And right, is this right, as Kishona puts into chat, right? Like, is this a moment of pleasure, of a euphoria, of exuberance, or is this abuse? And, you know, what would happen if you called somebody in on this session to say, what's happening in this room? What would happen to the musicians there? So that's the break, right? That space of representational space that's unique to sort of Black expression, that ties into the unknowable, this history of slave ships, of a common point of solidarity within the void, a thing that's bringing people together in a common way, a history that's been formed from the present, not the past. This is also right, when we talk about affect and what it means to be Black, what Cornel West calls Black sadness, what it means to be sitting in that coffee shop alone, looking around, seeing no one else like you. Or seeing everybody like you, and then it's not sadness, it's joy. Or Jose Munoz talks about his brown feeling. He's got this amazing essay also where he talks about the sort of rubs of kinship that people give each other when they understand each other from this point of minoritization and uneasiness. And so that's why I think when we talk about play, we need to think more about how play is torturous, how sometimes through play, people do horrible, awful things, brutal things, because that, I think, is the cultural memory that gets kept and lives on through things like slave songs, right? We're hearing these songs, we hear these screams because it's important to memorialize this history of trauma and abuse. And I think that that's something that play does and can do if we let it. But I think we need to get away from this sort of Eurocentric notion that play is only pleasurable if we are to bring in these sort of affects of pain into the conversation about play. All right, so one last song, and then we'll be on the way out. Bad Brains was the only Black hardcore band in DC, and I'm just gonna play this song. I've got a few things to say about it, and then yeah. So like if I didn't have the lyrics on the screen, right, we'd be back in that space of illegibility, of that understanding only through affect, understanding only through what the kinship of the scene, what the sounds in the walls and the sounds vibrating amongst us mean, right? And that's kind of the point, right? So, right, and Bad Brains is writing also from the space of otherness, from being, you know, othered in the DC hardcore scene, being the only Black people playing this kind of music. In the lyrics, play to pay, the price of play here is that of social reproduction, pay to come, right? These are things that tie in the cost of paying, that it's not a free thing for BIPOC people to just join into any game, any scene, anything, right? There's a price to that. And I think that's all in this song here. It's really well put. Also, I think that here, right, imagine the thrashing mob singing along, dancing along to this song, thinking about play also as this act of violence, right, where one becomes othered, right, where one gets put in the hold, one becomes the shift, one gets made into an object. I think that's really part of what's happening with play, theoretically. And I think I think that's a really important part of my theory of play, and getting into this theory that centers the BIPOC experience there. Right. And so, you know, to conclude, I wanted to just think about this as play's arrest. I think play has arrested us all. I think it's ensorcelled us in a number of ways, and that this is a really important way to think through and start discussing play. I think we should think about reparations when we talk about play, as a way to repair what's happened. And by reparations, I mean thinking about forms of play, forms of art, forms of expression that are created by BIPOC people, right? And I think that that's an important part of play's repair, is bringing in this more diverse group of artists into the forefront of what it means to play. I think other people in this room have theorized that also, so that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone here. And then also just going back to Moten and Harney, when they talk about the undercommons and they talk about the things that unite us all, being debt, right? I think this is part of it, right? Is that as long as we're under play's arrest, none of us can afford that sort of bail. And this project of reparations, of trying to find ways to bring in more BIPOC folk into the space of play, is really important. Thanks again to the organizers. This is a really wonderful thing. Thank you for giving me an extra few minutes when I wanted to play that one song, Phelan. I really appreciate that. And also, I don't think I did my land acknowledgement. I'm speaking on the side of the Tongva people, and really grateful to be able to do that here today. So thank you all. I'm looking forward to the other talks.
Thank you, Aaron. I am just going to jump right in and introduce our next speaker. Although I want to thank everybody. This is a wonderful event. Thank you, Phelan, especially for putting together a really remarkable event today. Next up is Kishonna Gray, and Dr. Kishonna L. Gray is an associate professor in the Writing, Rhetoric, and Digital Studies program at the University of Kentucky. She is an interdisciplinary, intersectional digital media scholar whose areas of research include identity, performance, and online environments, embodied deviance, cultural production, video games, and Black cyberfeminism. Dr. Gray is the author of Intersectional Tech, Black Users in Digital Gaming. She is also the author of Race, Gender, and Deviance in Xbox Live, and is the co-editor of 2 volumes on culture and gaming, Feminism in Play and Woke Gaming. Dr. Gray has published in a variety of outlets across disciplines and has also been featured in public outlets such as The Guardian, The Telegraph, and The New York Times. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate you so much. This has just been amazing and wonderful. From what we just heard, like from Aaron and Chris's talk, and and then of course Bo is just gonna like take us like to that next level. Like I'm just so inspired. I can't wait for the conversation because I just have so many thoughts. But Aaron really made me think about, because I think it's a perfect segue. What Aaron was just talking about. I'll share slides. My bad. Let me go ahead and do that first. Aaron gave us really like such a powerful narrative, and especially with the I'm trying to share this. I'm trying to share my slides. Okay, I think they're there. And especially with the thing that I've been wrangling with the most, like you know, it's a beautiful thematic that we have, you know, these problematic pleasures, right? And then one of the things that immediately, you know, came to mind when I hear like the word pleasure was joy, right? So there are all kinds of like conversations, you know, around like joy, and we have to, you know, let's not focus so much on like the all the negative doom and gloom, you know, the oppression and the resistance, right? But I think that there is something that needs to be said about these kind of concepts, and I think Aaron really, you know, made it really significant, you know, why we have to. I looked up the definition between, you know, pleasure and joy, you know, before, you know, I did this talk. I was like, okay, what do these words actually mean? You know, because we throw them around. I'm like, we know what pleasure is, we know what joy is. And pleasure and joy had the same definition, just according to Google. Now I didn't do nothing, no deep dive. And I was like, you know, what does Google say? You know, how does it define these words? And they're basically the same. Now that didn't sit well with me because I don't get the same feelings from both of them. So I'm going to redefine it because y'all know me. That's just what I'm going to do. I'm just going to do what I want to do. So whenever I thought about like this concept of joy, I look at it as more of something that comes within, a very much like an internal engagement of what is within and what can come out, you know, so that internal joy, the internal satisfaction, the contentment, you know, some of the things that we hold space for, especially in spite of everything that's happening like around us, right? And I look at something like pleasure as something external, you know, so I immediately thought about like, you know, the intimate, you know, the sexual connotation of like pleasure, you know, something is done to us or we do something to ourselves and we derive pleasure from that. And we derive, you know, significant and extreme, like, you know, joyous emotions, you know, around that. So I looked at, you know, pleasure and joy, like in a dichotomous kind of way. You know, I looked at joy as like something that is stemming from the inside, and then pleasure as something that's external. And then, you know, I factored in, you know, this little thing that we call play and gaming in there. So I was like, you know, where does gaming fit? And I immediately like went down, you know, like it wasn't like a rabbit hole. It was really like a necessary discussion that I had to have with myself about, you know, what has my journey with gaming, you know, been, especially around like pleasure and play, right? And so it led me to this concept that I wanted to, I guess the title of this little talk, or this, I'm really just going to be, you know, sharing my thoughts, you know, more than anything like formal, but it's, I call it pleasurable play interrupted. So it's kind of like a history, you know, it's like my own like genealogy within gaming and within play. And then I have to like take you back, you know, because when I think about gaming, I immediately think about joy, but I also, and pleasure. And I also think about just these moments that interrupt that. And I think that those are significant, and those have really informed, you know, the kinds of things that I do in gaming right now. Please let me know if I'm going over time, you know, because I'm just kind of just talking. But you know, one of the moments that I want to take you to, like a time before, of course, streaming, you know, a time before selfies and Twitter, a time before, you know, even before like Facebook was just on campuses. You know, I want to really think back even further to the 90s. You know, I'm a 90s gamer. And you know, so I'm not the first generation of gamers. You know, I think maybe I don't know what generation, maybe I'm like a third or fourth generation of gamer. But I want to take you all back. Even before hashtags. Yeah. I remember trying to explain to my granny what a hashtag was, and she said, the thing on the phone. I'm like, no, it's something else, granny. But anyway, but we're gonna go back to like 1997 because this was a very significant moment for me in my gaming life. GoldenEye 007 had just came out, right? And my friend had a Dreamcast, another friend had Nintendo 64, and I still had the Sega. But I remember this concept that we would consider multiplayer gaming, right? Something that these folks are calling couch co-op now, which I don't like, and I think we need to push back on that because I think we were the original multiplayer gamers. But I'm just thinking about all of the joy that I experienced in these spaces of sharing with my friends, about how we created like our own networks. You know, we had a friend down the street, up the street, in the bottom, up the hill. You know, we had friends all over the place, but we had these vast networks of like gaming, you know, in which we would experience. But I remember GoldenEye 007 being like the first, it was also the first game that I had played, you know, with the fancy, you know, when the controllers added the analog and all that stuff. And so it was really like a different like experience, right? And so here you have, you know, it's like this really, it's a beautiful game. It sounds good. So you have this sonic experience, you have this haptic experience, you know, the controllers, you know, think about like, especially when PlayStation came out, you know, you have the controllers that are then jumping. So then it's like sense overload, right? And I know that sounds like in the time that we were playing, but I remember just going back to that moment and just thinking about all of those things that were converging like in that moment to create a very pleasurable experience like in gaming, right? And also, if we think about, the time, the point that I'm really trying to make is that, although I am me and my gaming experience, like with our friends, we're very isolated in that, but there are all kinds of things that's happening around us. And so I wanted to also think back to that moment. What else was happening in like 1997? So I think, Clinton's president, Notorious B.I.G. had just been killed, Timothy McVeigh was convicted, Mike Tyson bit off Holyfield's ear, so there were a lot of things that were happening like politically too. I mean, and I think it's important to remember that all these things are kind of happening like on the periphery of our experiences, right? And it's not like we weren't inundated with it. It wasn't like in our face kind of like engagements, because social media in a way that we think about it today, hadn't happened. And so of course other games during this time that don't get talked about, Metal Gear Solid, Crash Bandicoot, Resident Evil, Lara Croft, all these things are very significant to what became most of our careers like in gaming, right? But it's also important that we don't often talk about some of the class and the console wars or the platform wars that were emerging during this time too. Most of which I was experiencing gaming, it was all console gaming. There was no computers because we didn't have access to computers. I'm thinking about, there was no bandwidth. There was no, it's all, download, you had to use the phone jacks and everything like that, so all of this was happening like during that time, but I don't think we realized just how significant, these moments were, until we kind of look back and really like interrogate them. And then another moment, because like I said, I experienced gaming and pleasure around gaming, thinking about these significant moments. And the next significant moment is 2001. Where a year of amazing games. GTA, the top down, kind of game where I played it on a computer at a friend's house. There was somebody that did have a computer, and that was the first game that I played on PC. But something else, significant happened during 2001. It was also the year that I went to college. It was my first year in college, but 9/11 had happened, right? And that was a significant moment that I realized just how significant mediated narratives and mediated landscapes are going to be. Because I remember also there was like a night and day change where immediately, of course, we all can recall that. But then I remember mediated narratives, really were trying to sell us, the story of like, the Muslims as terrorists, Middle Eastern folks as bad. And also those creeped into the games that we were playing as well. And so during that time, a lot of us, although I was away from a city center, I went to undergrad in a rural area, but there was a significant population of international students, a lot of them who came from Middle Eastern countries. And so I was intimately connected to this, because they were here, wondering, if they were going to have to go home, seeing their homeland, being decimated and destroyed. And so it was a really interesting way to be connected to them in that moment. But the respite for them was gaming. It was console gaming. We had LAN parties. We would connect our Xboxes and to the local area network in our dorms, and so we were able to derive a lot of pleasure in the face of so much pain. Which is why when Aaron was talking, and I put it in the chat, and I was like, "There's a really thin line, between pleasure and pain." So when we heard, just the sister on that track, just like engaging in those moments of the hollers and screams and the howls, the wailing, there are so many things that were just happening, sonically, we're hearing this experience, but you have to think about, what is she feeling in those moments? And I think for so many of us who are connected, to diasporic lands, who are connected to our ancestral lands, or, we have those ancestral connections, we have this collective experience of where we can know and feel exactly what somebody else is feeling, right? Now, not to say that, because I couldn't understand what it meant to be away from your home. I didn't understand what it meant to be Muslim. I didn't understand those things, but I knew that there was something that was connecting me to those folks because of the singular experience of oppression that a lot of us had experienced during that time. Right. And so we're in this, 9/11 world, it's not a post 9/11 framework. I don't think it ever has been post, but I think that experience that we had during that time really set the stage for gaming being these safe havens and these safe spaces when all else is going to shit around us, right? And so here was this moment of where this pleasurable play is interrupted, but we were able to reclaim the joy. We were able to find the joy, and this is why I think it's important that I made that designation between pleasure and joy. I think we were able to find it, in one another, and to create communities of support, especially for folks who were experiencing, all these things. And then we had, 2002, another round of great games, but also something that was happening was the isolated singular kind of music experience. I had a Zune. I'm not sure if people even remember Zune. I feel like Zune was so much better than that little, what was that, the iPod or whatever. Look at me saying it like it wasn't significant, but the Zune was so important. And I remember being able to connect my gaming experience on the Xbox, with my Zune. And that was huge, because here you have this moment of like these convergent spaces, these convergent mediums, kind of coming together at the same time. And I think this was around, this is approaching like 2004 and 2005. And there was another significant moment because that was also the time that, I think the first consoles had gone online, Xbox went online. Now I know this sounds like especially for folks who grew up like on PC game, and they're like, yeah, we did that. We have been doing that. But I think this was huge for the console space. And I don't think we give, console spaces like enough love and acknowledge how innovative, they were in such a short period of time, and how significant that was to connect, a lot of these populations like together. So it was huge, right? And so I think, one of the first chats that I experienced was probably in Halo 2. But we also know in that moment of extreme pleasure, there was also moments of intense pain because, those spaces were immediately toxic. I'm not going to go down that path and talk about that because, our work, discusses that. But I think it was really, really interesting, just and how we had these innovative things happening, and we want to celebrate them, right? But I think it's important, that we also critically like interrogate, the things that are happening like around these spaces, to make sure that we address them in meaningful ways, so we don't replicate, some of those same patterns of things happening. Now, another game that just was the most amazing thing ever that came out was GTA San Andreas. Now, this was a huge thing. And I probably should write about this because, we don't talk about those collegiate communities of gaming like enough, of where, we all really, although, Xbox was live, PlayStation was working on it, but we still had this multiplayer gaming where we all played together. So we would all meet up in the lobbies of our residential dorms, which is where we all met in the lobbies of our dorms, and we would take turns playing. So how we did this, most of us, if you played it too, you just played until you got wasted. Right. And so then we would play, we would do missions probably several times. And then what was beautiful about those spaces, a lot of pleasure was that we were building up, all the knowledges that we like, do it this way, don't do it that way. This might be better, to help each other out. Because it didn't matter, who eventually won or who beat the mission, because we all collectively did it, so I think, there was a light, and especially when we would bring other people into that space, it was important that they were onboarded to know, like, we're not competing with one another. We're trying to beat this game, and we do it collectively. So a lot of times, the people who started, they would be, the ones that would die quickly. And depending on how many people showed up to play that day, it really, they may not have had like another turn. And especially as we got better, with these sandbox kind of games and like with the mission-based games, we were figuring things out, and we knew how to do it. And this is also before the era of like cheat codes. I remember one time somebody came in with like a cheat code. We was just so mad because they had, it took the fun out of it, right? Because it was just unlimited ammo. They dropped the tank in the middle of the street and just did a mission. It was like, that's not fun. You're taking away the enjoyment, right, of the game. And so I think there was something when we think about how we want to engage within these games, some of those elements that might be considered very normal for some gamers were very toxic, for others. But also what's significant, I think, about CJ CJ from San Andreas was this was probably one of the first times that we're able to play a Black character that has like a detailed story arc. There's a plot. It's more than just like a few repeatable lines. I think I heard, Chris talking about some of the characters like from Street Fighter and from some of those Final Fantasy. A lot of them, they just had like, repeatable lines that you just heard like right before like a game starts. But this was significant because we were able to like, see some layers of Black life, although very unidimensional. It's telling like a snapshot of a particular kind of Black life, but I think it was still significant, and it existed in like a moment of time. It was just this convergence of gaming and hip hop that was really also happening. Did I put that slide up there? I did not put that slide up there, but I should have put the slide up there that also had Def Jam Vendetta. I'm not sure if y'all remember the Def Jam series where you're actually a rapper. It was just like, if you're playing like a fighter game, if you're playing like Injustice and you're playing like Superman and Batman or whoever, you could pick like Method Man and DMX and they could be fighting. It was amazing. And hopefully, they bring that back for the next gen consoles. But again, because we also had to sit with what the narratives from San Andreas was giving us, that pleasure and that play was interrupted. We had to sit with that moment of saying, oh, okay, yes, they're going to give us this narrative because it's the narrative of Black criminality, of Black drug dealers. Media won't shy away from that. So of course, gaming will give us those narratives as well. So in these moments where we had so much immense joy of seeing just Black characters animated and brought to life in this way, we also had to say, well, okay, here's another ghettoized version of this with no context of how they happen to be in the ghetto. There's no discussion of like the abuse and overuse of power by the police, which the opening scene gives us. The opening scene set the stage for for this surveillance into CJ's life. So we have these really interesting like moments of where we can escape from realities, we can escape from our day-to-day lives, but then games constantly give us these reminders, just thinking about how powerful Chris's discussion was about how a lot of these games think that they're doing something, but in fact they're just essentializing our cultures, the Orientalism, the racialization of and the essentialism of like Blackness. These things continue to happen in those moments. And then August 2005 happened. So this is approaching like the end of my collegiate career, my undergraduate career, and then I went on to graduate school. I think August 2005 was the first year of my master's program. And something else happened that interrupted the pleasure and the joy. Hurricane Katrina happened. And I think this is like one of those 9/11 moments of where it just completely it's like a complete paradigm shift, a complete ideological shift. The things that you thought were and the world that you thought you were in was, reminded you of so many realities, right? And so like most of us, we're just sitting with these images pouring out from us. And it was also, I put this up here, I should have put it after. I think it's important to recognize this is a pre-Twitter world, right? Nobody was just, hashtagging anything like to connect. Facebook was kind of popping, but I think Facebook was still on college campuses. Like the masses did not have Facebook. So we didn't really have social media in a way that we think about it. What did we have? We had things like MySpace. MySpace was popping. We had Black Planet. We had Mi Gente. We had Asian Avenue. So we had a lot of these cultural enclaves, in some of these spaces. And then when we found MySpace, I think all the white people left and they're like, we need something. Oh, Facebook, yay. And then, that's basically how that happened. But I think it's really important that we recognize that, there was no social media to connect these stories and these narratives of folks together. So we're relying on the media to tell us, but we have to remember what narratives did media also give us. And it was also in these moments that I realized, this is what my thesis project was doing and what I thought my dissertation was going to be. I was really inspired by the stories that people were sharing in comment sections, like of these news stories that were happening. That the comment section was a new thing. Not all stories had them, but I think CNN, the AP stories and the CNN stories actually had comment section. And you had people that were trying to find one another in these in these chats, like people being displaced. You know, you had families who were like, okay, we're going to Houston, but grandma went to Nashville. And like they were really using these spaces to find one another. And that was, you know, at the time I didn't use this word or didn't use this framework, but later I would apply that as like a Black digital praxis of like, hey, we gonna make a way out of no way, right? And I think even moving beyond, I'm thinking about, you know, when, especially when Aaron was talking about the breaks, you know, especially, you know, when you think about like these are the breaks, you know, it's like, hey, this is just how life is. This is just what happens. You know, when we saw these images like on our screen, we was like, of course we got neglected in this manner. Of course our government is just going to ignore us. Of course nobody's going to save us because these are the breaks, right? And I think there was a moment that happened in those digital spaces where we were like, hey, maybe we can use these tools like to reframe a narrative. Maybe we can use these tools to kind of connect with one another. Maybe we can use these tools to actually have a movement and to resist, you know, a lot of the oppression that's happening to us. And I think that those are some of the powerful things that happen in a lot of these moments. But something else that I also realized that I was with my project, I was really going to have to think about like the larger structure that drives media and technology in these mediated industries and how they're fueled by technology. You know, they're not neutral. I think a lot of the things that I had read during that time, you know, really gave us a very like deterministic like view of so many of these of the mediated project, right? You know, it was, you know, when I read Omi and Winans Racial Project, I'm like, yep, that's media, you know, that's technology. You know, I read Bonilla Silva's, you know, his work like on, you know, color evasive, you know, like ideology or colorblind ideology, but, you know, that color evasive, you know, ideology was so significant. Even Pierre Bourdieu's, you know, symbolic violence was like useful. So that was like some of the earliest, you know, frameworks that I was applying onto understanding like media and understanding technology and really understand that they were all rooted in like this white capitalist, you know, supremacy, right? And then, you know, when it going into my PhD program, I started adding like additional layers of like understanding. You know, I learned about Iris Marion Young's 5 Faces of Oppression. I read Bell Hooks. I read Black feminist thought. And then of course, you know, I fell in love with all those things and I fell in love with intersectionality too. And so it was necessary for me to, you know, I was starting to build these theoretical foundations to really make sense of the linkages between like poverty and wealth, race, class, sexuality, neglect. You know, that was all me trying to make sense of Hurricane Katrina. And I didn't realize that these would be the same foundations that I would bring into my work in gaming, because the same conversations, you know, were happening in those spaces. I just didn't realize it I didn't realize it at the time, right? Not sure what the next slide is here. Oh, yeah, the gaming slides. That's cute. I don't know where I found that at. That's super cute. But I think because of my, you know, my background and my interest in like Black feminism and intersectionality, it really made me recognize and have to like acknowledge that these are minoritized and marginalized identities, like it impact what our experiences are in not only just physical spaces, but also digital spaces. And so I began to start thinking about, my this pathway that led me here. And I often think back to how significant, you know, that moment of like Hurricane Katrina was. But I also get sad because, as most of y'all know, I didn't continue with that work, right? I stopped that work because I realized like the world didn't care. And there was like a whole Twitter thread just the other day that was talking, I think here's that thin line between pleasure and pain, you know, because I got so much joy, you know, in doing that work and seeing like people get connected, but I also recognized like the pain that was there, you know, because of, you know, the collective memory and the collective trauma of what folks went through there, but also how that was like, that reverberated, you know, to other Black communities. I realized, especially after my advisor told me that whatever you do for your dissertation is what you're going to be doing for the next 10 years of your academic career. I was like, ain't no way in hell I could do this. You know, there's just no way that I would be able to do this and maintain my sanity to do that, right? And so I switched gears, but then I ended up doing inside gaming as well, as most of you all know. So but at least I had the lightness of the play. No matter how political or ideological or rooted in torture, you know, like play is, you know, we're able to still find those moments of respite and get those breaks from it, right? And I remember I had an advisor during my PhD program, you know, when I was talking about, like I said, I just want to do games. I want to do something that's not that serious, right? And then, you know, I had this advisor, kind of like the Cornel West type of like advisor, you know, he was like, you must tackle this oppression head on. It's about power and legacies of, you just know that that professor, that Black studies professor that's just always in that. He wasn't like a tech professor, and I'm sure he probably said something like, the internet was built off the backs of slaves. I guarantee he said something like that. But he asked me a really important question. He said, Kishana, anytime that you're doing this work, you have to ask yourself, which came first, racism or that. And I think in that moment he said, what came first, racism or the technology? And I said racism. So he said, you got to start there. You can't start with the technology. You have to start at the roots of where all of these oppressions and these legacies of oppression came from. How am I for time? I guess I need to look at the camera and see if anybody's talking to me. I'm so sorry. I'm just having a great time.
We're close to time.
We are okay. All right. I think I was there anyway. I think, I was just going to give a plug for what intersectional tech was. And here, I'll just end with this quote right here. Gaming, which often lies outside of conversations on Blackness and digital praxis, is a medium that is becoming more visible, viable, and legible in making sense of Black technoculture. Intersectional tech implores us to render visible the force of discursive practices that position users within disorderly social hierarchies and arrangements. The explicit formulations of the normative order sometimes disagree with the concrete human condition and are inconsistent with the consumption and production practices that constitute Black digital labor. It is, in fact, these practices that inform the theoretical underpinnings of Black performances, cultural production, exploited labor, and resistance strategies inside oppressive technological structures in which Black users reside. Listen, that night I was working on that part. I was like, listen, I am on fire tonight. Listen, that is a fire-ass paragraph. Let me put that in that book. So it's a lot to unpack. I know it's there, but it's just such a beautiful statement, and I love it so much. I hold it dear to my heart. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. Thank you all. I appreciate y'all so much.
Thank you so much, Kishana. Last but not least, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Bo Ruberg, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Film and Media Studies at the University of California, Irvine, as well as the incoming editor of the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies. Yay! Their research explores gender and sexuality in digital media and digital cultures. They are author of Video Games Have Always Been Queer, from 2019, The Queer Games Avant-Garde, How LGBTQ Game Makers Are Reimagining the Medium of Video Games from 2020, and the forthcoming Sex Dolls at Sea, Imagined Histories of Sexual Technologies. Take it away, Bo.
Awesome, thanks so much. Thanks so much to all of my amazing fellow presenters. Thanks so much to the organizers. I feel like as the last one up, my job is to try and bring some threads together, but also to be like speedy and peppy because we are on Zoom for a little bit. So I will try and do that and give me 1 sec to open my slides. Okay, great. Are you seeing slides now, full screen? Yes, okay, great. So I am Bo Ruberg. I use they, them pronouns. I'm at UC Irvine along with the wonderful Erin Trammell. I'm going to talk to you today about queer pleasures in games. And I really love this idea of the problematic, as we kicked off saying, as an ambivalent term. So I made myself some frantic notes. And I think the things that you'll hear here in terms of that ambivalence are thinking about pleasure that is problematic, thinking about pleasure that is often deemed problematic. My pin is a little cat with a whip that says pervert. It's my very favorite piece of jewelry. Pleasure that we should problematize and pleasure that itself problematizes. So hopefully you'll hear a little bit of all of those things here. Again, this is me. I always like to show this image because the work that I do is never done alone. It is always done collaboratively. I co-run a lab, the CATS lab at UC Irvine with Erin. And a number of amazing grad students, many of whom are here with us today. So even when this work is done with me alone in my room, it is always based on inspiration, often from amazing grad students. These are some of the projects that I've worked on. I won't talk about them too much in depth, but I like to mention them just because they represent different approaches, one theoretical, one kind of community-based. The Queer Games Avant-Garde was co-edited with Adrian Shaw, one based on game design. This is my new book, which I also won't go into here, but in case you're into sex tech and nautical things and the history of sex toys, it's coming out soon, and I highly recommend it. So when the organizers reached out about this event and this sort of theme of problematic pleasures, I was like, oh, that's an interesting idea. I wonder how that applies to me. And then I had this moment where it's like, oh, that's like literally your whole thing. So what I'm going to talk about here is not one specific example of a game or a topic. It's more kind of trying to reflect on these threads across my work so that we can hopefully draw out some useful takeaways for thinking about pleasure in games. Just as some background on myself and problematic pleasures. So I was a sex tech and games reporter before going to grad school, but what I actually went to grad school for was to study French Surrealism and the work of the Marquis de Sade. This is a picture of me and my shadow at Lacoste, which is the ancestral home of the Marquis de Sade, where I have made multiple pilgrimages. My most prized possessions are old copies of Story of O. This is just to say that these very problematic cultural objects and histories of pleasure are strangely dear to my heart. I wrote a dissertation that was partially about games, but really about the relationship between media and digital media and BDSM and kink, which I think has a lot of resonance with what we're talking about today. So that's very much the background that I bring to what I do mostly these days, which is talk about queerness and video games. Queerness in video games for me means a ton of different stuff, this blast of things on your screen. It means, analyzing games queerly, looking at queer representation, looking at this sort of amazing growing network of queer and trans indie folks making games, looking at queer history. But the question that I wanted to ask myself today is, what is the relationship between queerness in games, this kind of area I work in, and problematic pleasures? And what I found as I look back across my work is that I'm often doing this work of questioning or reimagining the relationships between queerness, pleasure, games, and play. So let me draw a few of those threads. Okay, so the first thread is this idea of challenging, problematic, and for me, that often means heteronormative pleasures. I think we can also hear, what Erin's saying about white supremacist pleasures, definitely parallels there as well. So some of those pleasures that I push back against are fun, empathy, and mastery. Come on, slides, one sec. This slide makes me happy. So some of my work around approaching games queerly has been about challenging the idea of fun, seeing fun in games as a hegemonic concept, the idea that when games are designed or when games are played, that they are supposed to be fun, that they are supposed to feel good in a kind of normative way. I would like us all to resist that idea. I would like us to question what fun means and for whom, and to think about the games that we can create and the games that we can play in new ways if we take the traditional kind of game design idea of fun and throw it out the window. One of my favorite examples of that is what you see here, which is Burnout, which is a series about crashing things instead of succeeding at car races. I'm interested in refusing empathy. So empathy you might not initially think of as a kind of pleasure, but I think that it is. I think that especially around queer games and games that represent folks of color, we see a kind of white cis normative response where people say, oh, I can empathize, I can step into people's shoes, I can feel good, take pleasure in myself as an ally. And a lot of folks have pushed back on that. Wendy Chun, Lisa Nakamura, Robert Yang, Teddy Pozo. I think we're seeing amazing work on making things obscure, making things opaque, like Danielle Brathwaite Shirley's Black Trans Archive. So for me, that too is about resisting a problematic pleasure. And then what I mean by abandoning mastery is to take the idea that we often have of games that we are supposed to do well, we are supposed to be skilled. I mean, I think in this room, broadly speaking, we already know to challenge that, but it's still quite dominant in games culture. And instead to look to games like Realistic Kissing Simulator, which is a wonderfully absurd game about licking people, licking each other, to look at games that do not have goals, that do not allow for mastery, that instead foreground consent and things like that as new models for the pleasure of games. So what do we take from this? I would say a few things. The expectation that games give pleasure is normativizing, right? So when we expect games to be fun or to make us feel empathy, that can take the vast potential of games and constrain it into codified ideas of games in play. sometimes the pleasures that players expect from games can be oppressive, right? Whether it's impressive in terms of the norms of design or oppressive in terms of the way that people try and kind of consume marginalized experience through something like empathy. And that when we refuse those normative pleasures, we are potentially finding and embracing these queer pleasures, right? We're finding alternate ways to find pleasure through games. So then the second thread that I found myself looking at, which kind of ties to that last point, is looking at pleasure as a tool for a radical queer reclamation of games. I really love the point that Chris made early on that there has been a trend in game studies, kind of canonical game studies, to take pleasure and say, yeah, games are pleasurable, but we don't mean sexual pleasure. We're not talking, it's not sexual, right? And I'm really interested in how we can re-embrace the erotic, re-embrace the sexualness of that pleasure. So for me, one of the things that means is to look at games that have queer resonances and to find the things that are sexy about them. So I just finished a piece on Katamari Damacy and also Donut County, the title of which is Hungry Holes and Insatiable Balls, which sounds weird to say out loud. It seems okay on paper, which is in part about Katamari Damacy as a game about, you know, rolling up these increasingly large balls that like are endlessly hungry, and then shooting them off into space for your very queer flamboyant dad to approve of. We can, you know, think more about that. There's a lot more to say there, but I think there are lots of examples of these games that we can lean into instead of leaning away from their sexual implications. I also think about envisioning queer joy, which relates very much to what Krishna is saying about joy and Black joy, looking instead of to games that think of queerness as an experience just of loss and pain, and instead looking to work like Sayonara Wild Hearts, which is this music and kind of rhythm game with non-binary and femme folks like fighting and kissing and dancing all at the same time, and this amazingly bisexual color scheme. To think of games as being able to give us a kind of queer joy and queer pleasure. And then to use our own play to claim that queer pleasure, to take queer pleasure in these radical spaces. This is Noor by T.J. Hughes. And this is an example of a game that, again, has no rules, has no real structure. You are playing around with food. You are like throwing pancakes and pouring syrup and sprinkling sprinkles on top of ice cream. And I really adore this project because to me, there's a kind of like abject, indulgent queer pleasure just in playing with the world. Okay, so what do we take from that thread? We have this idea that pleasure can kind of unearth the queer potential in games. And it does that through feeling, right? It does that through how it feels to play, or how, you know, if it feels badly, if it feels good, right? That brings us to queer meaning. It can remake games as exuberant queer spaces. And for me, that often means for games that don't look queer, they might look oppressive. They might look like they don't include queer folks, but kind of reclaiming them and using them for exuberance and pleasure. And that something like queer pleasure can be the opposite of fun, right? Fun is so slippery. I started wondering, as someone who kind of hates fun, then I'm like, but is there queer fun? That's okay, I'll leave that there. So queer pleasure kind of resists that structured idea of fun and instead allows us to think about all of the other things that games can be. So this third and final thread is about questioning problematic cultural notions about pleasure in and around games. One of the things that this has meant for me in my career so far is looking at and interrogating representations of pleasure, and especially representations of sex work in games. That has to do with how sex workers are represented on screen, but it also has to do with the kind of interactions that games structure around them. So often we see games that present sex work as something that will be given to a player or a player character for free. It kind of devalues the value of the labor of sex workers, and it makes sex work part of an interactive scheme of, you know, getting money from sex workers, getting health from sex workers. It uses the systems of games to not just represent, but actually devalue that kind of sexual labor. I am very interested in looking at the role of pleasure in bias and in gamer culture. For example, some of my wonderful collaborators on work on live streaming are here today. And one of the things that we have definitely found is that live streaming, as this kind of growing center of a lot of games culture today, is often structured around biases that relate to pleasure. So women's bodies will be policed on live streaming platforms because they, in theory, cause too much pleasure in straight male viewers. We see controversies like the one around hot tub streaming, where certain streamers, would wear bathing suits and stream from kiddie pools, and this is deemed as sort of destroying a platform like Twitch because it brings it too close to sex work, too close to webcam modeling. And then the last part of this thread is to question the tools that games are built on. I have done some work before on physics and physics engines as a really integral part of games today, and how the physics that we use in games today comes from a lot of early work done around breast physics, and how this kind of, again, like straight male desire to replicate bodies, cis women's bodies, to master cis women's bodies, actually have become foundations for the very technological systems that we use to make games. So some takeaways from that thread: there are real cultural ramifications for how we turn pleasure into play, right? How we make playable systems that represent pleasure. Often the pleasure of straight cis men is precisely what dictates the terms of gamer legitimacy. And then pleasure has shaped the gaming technologies that underlie games themselves. So what do we do with all of that, right? How do we bring all of that together? I think that's a bigger question than I quite know the answer to yet, but this is the overall thing I would leave you with. So when it comes to play, pleasure always matters. That's true no matter the intention of the game. That's true no matter how serious the game is. Pleasure is always at stake. Pleasure always matters. But ultimately, we can ask ourselves, and we should ask ourselves, who is it that we want to give pleasure to, right? Whose pleasure do we want to serve? Because pleasure is not objective. Pleasure is not one thing. And then whose pleasure do we want to destroy? So I will leave you there, and thank you so much for listening.
Fantastic questions to end on. Thank you, Bo. We're going to roll right through into some discussion here. I just wanted to listen to everyone keep talking forever, and so we have a little bit less time than we planned for. But I think if it's okay with the presenters, we can probably roll a little bit past 3 o'clock, but not too far. I want to respect people's time, obviously. But really, I kind of, the selfish thing in staging this panel was that I really genuinely would like to hear you all in conversation with one another. So I would love, if anyone has a point upon which they would like to start the conversation, please throw it out. I have some thoughts, obviously, but please, if anyone has like a niggling thought or something that they just had to throw out there, go for it.
I'll start.
Go for it.
One of the things I remember having like a conversation with somebody about saying, because of all of our social locations, all of us, we're in marginalized and minoritized bodies, right? Folks were like saying that we couldn't talk about the pleasurable aspects of it. So did y'all like experience, having some of those kinds of conversations around like wanting to focus on, we got to focus on the resistance and the oppression and these racisms and these transphobia, like we focus on those, and I was like, these things can all exist at the same time. Did you all have like any conundrums of like, incorporating, some of those like conversations around, like just pleasure and just joy? And I know, Aaron, we've talked about it, like some, especially, at the intersections of like Blackness and everything that's going on around us, since our academic careers have happened. So I guess I just want to put that out there, to see about, if folks experience things like that.
I can answer first. I love that question. And I think it's a great place to start off the discussion. I feel like all my work is kind of like responding to that, actually. And that's why I found so much help, I guess, in that, and reading folks like Eve Sedgwick and, reparative reading, Jose Munoz, and certain kinds of queer theory. And I feel like with games, that's especially a question that's gotten much more controversial, I guess. At least in Asian American studies circles, we had like Lisa Nakamura, who I absolutely adore, whose work has been totally foundational to what I do. But in one of her essays in the 90s, she talks about identity tourism, right? And how playing a Black character or an Asian character, and she's mostly talking about text room role playing, so it doesn't quite translate well into other arenas. But it did become like the only way for a long time. It felt like people could talk about race in games was through a kind of identity tourism lens, which I think early on it was some scholars were just looking at that like, well, who do you assume is playing the game if you think everyone's doing identity tourism? So that's the first problem. But then now we have work by like Legacy Russell, Glitch Feminism, where she does like a very brief but very direct takedown of that whole idea. Legacy Russell being like queer Black feminist, right? Feeling like that kind of attitude towards games has just made it seem like a space that doesn't invite her point of view, right? And I feel like critical game studies has created that space thanks to people like Adrian Shaw and Bo Ruberg and you and a lot of other people in here, a lot of people in the audience. I don't think I would be in game studies were it not for the folks who push that way, because I was in game studies groups. I went to some game studies conferences in like before the 2010s and early 2010s, and they were just horrible spaces. And it felt like I didn't want to do game studies, though I had so many ideas about it. And then, Adrian Shaw's essay about critical game studies came out. I think that was 2010. Other work started coming out. Conferences started happening, again, thanks to folks in this room. That did kind of allow us to be like, it's okay that you are involved in this. And like I was saying, I think this resonated with you too, Kishona, in the chat, that in ethnic studies areas, they still see it that way, right? And it's really hard to organize any kind of game studies events in like Asian American studies and Black studies and so on, because it's seen as a very problematic medium in itself. And I do feel like though, like Indigenous studies and settler colonialism has been a bit more inviting to it than others. But yeah, I know at UBC, for example, a lot of the work that happens is centered around Indigenous communities.
Any thoughts on this great question about the kind of double bind that you end up in when looking at games or play or pleasure, of like not being critical enough of the thing or being dismissed because the thing is not serious enough, right? It seems like in game studies, I was like, pleasure is both very prominent and not at all discussed simultaneously somehow. And that is very weird. I'm curious, other takes on that.
Yeah, I thank you for the question. I feel like this is the space we all live in, right? That like people are constantly questioning the seriousness of the work, but then on the other side, right, folks in kind of more mainstream games culture are saying we take things too seriously. I think that's the bind that I always feel like I'm in, is that I talk to scholars in more traditional fields. My PhD is in comparative literature, so I come from a kind of very traditional humanities discipline, and it's like, games, right? But then when you go into game spaces, I often am in dialogue with industry. It's like, why are you taking it so seriously? I feel like I've managed it by just, I don't know, just being like, screw all of you. Like, this is a thing that is deeply in my own heart. And I find that too in game studies, that there's a kind of divide between scholars, even in critical game studies, where there are folks who do truly amazing work who are there because they don't love games. Like, they see the prominence of games and they see their cultural influence and they feel like they demand critique, and it's true. But then there are also those of us, and I think actually all of the presenters today fall in this camp, who are here because we love games. And of course are problematizing them, and of course are critiquing them, but like come from a space of these have been deeply meaningful to us in our own lives. So I think there's also that tension I see within the field more broadly.
Yeah, I kind of also think it's important that we embrace the things that we love and can own it and not have to alienate that from ourselves and our experience. Growing up mixed in like a white area, so much of my life was alienating myself from my Blackness, only to come back to it and then understand what that meant and what that meant to me and my history. And I can't stand the idea of someone saying like, okay, I grew up with this game I love, I shouldn't love that. I have to alienate this part of my identity. I think that's violent, and we shouldn't do that.
I think that point or a variation on it is what I found so like compelling and challenging and confusing about Chris's book, actually, because Chris, and I think this is very explicit in Open World Empire, this idea that like it's not enough to simply diagnose like how horrible and problematic and imperialistic all of these games are. We also need to confront the fact that like, and also we play them and get a ton of pleasure out of them. And that pleasure, yeah, like to simply alienate ourselves from that is probably not even possible, let alone productive. And I wonder, like in your own experiences, and also like working with students as well, where you're dealing with students who are presumably in a lot of cases, certainly in my experience, like coming to studying games because they love games. What are the sort of practical techniques or modes of thought for dealing with that?
I think one of the things, and this is what I'm thinking in my mind, it may not be the question that you had asked, but one of the things that I think is really so significant of like folks' work, especially like, like Chris's work and like Tara's work, I'm thinking about, how, we have existed like in this dichotomy. I think we all probably quote that thing from, I think it was like Fullerton and Fron, they're like, gaming is primarily white and male, secondarily East Asian male. But I feel like, that put like a lot of like populations, especially, East Asian, populations in this like de-racialized space. And the thing that I love about, Chris's work is, saying, hey, okay, sure, we might exist as like this majority in these spaces, but what are our experiences in these spaces? And I think that that's something that, we don't, and especially with the example that Aaron just gave, especially in this, mixed race, biracial, especially the politics that are around that. It's like, we exist in these simultaneous like arenas of belonging and unbelonging and not belonging. And then we have to like reframe those narratives like constantly, because when we talk about these and say these things, we act like that they just should just exist like, for perpetuity, right? But they're always like shifting. And then these things are like, static and they're mobile and then they're changing. And so I think it's very significant, especially with all of our work, we continue to challenge and like critique, like a lot of those things. So I'm always honored to be in spaces like these, because I'm a huge fan of all of y'all's work. And it's always so central, to like the things that how I think and how I talk about this work. So I just wanted to just fangirl a bit and just say how much, y'all's work has really helped me in my own thinking and de-essentializing so many of the things that, that we all, we came through, especially being in grad school, like the mid 2000s, late 2000s.
This very much comes from a place of fandom on the organizer side as well. I'm going to throw a couple of questions from the Q&A from the audience here. There's a question from Akil saying, I wonder if the speakers can talk about the ways in which pain and pleasure intersects with the erotics of pain and pleasure in play, as gaming spaces are riddled with sexual references, which are often wrapped in race, gender, class, and finding pleasure through the domination and pain of their opponents. I think this cuts to some similar themes of what we've touched on, but I wonder if we could elaborate that on a little bit of like the pleasure in, the problematic pleasure of participating in that domination, even vicariously.
Maybe I can jump on that. Thank you, Akil, for that question. So I'm mostly jumping on this so I can say something short and then give it to Aaron. I mentioned that my dissertation was largely about kink and BDSM and digital play. And there are some reasons for that might be obvious if folks have thought about this, which is, right, like game design can be seen as a kind of topping of like creating this experience for people that play is often painful or punishing, and it can be seen as masochistic. But one of the reasons that I've largely left the dissertation stay put and haven't really written about it is I think those framings of like kink and play outside of other issues, especially race, are like, something's not quite right there. And so that's one of the reasons why, Aaron, I've really appreciated getting to hear about the work you're doing, because I feel like that actually picks up and starts to address some of those problems. So I'm curious if that resonates with you.
Yeah, totally. I think we've actually had conversations about this in the past once or twice. But I mean, there have been some this is where someone else in the room can help. I'm not as well read on kink as others, but I know there have been some ethnographic studies that really try to talk about kink and privilege, and the how this is happening in a really affluent sort of I would say, space, perhaps a white-coated space in some ways. And I think that that's really important when thinking through pleasure and erotics here, right? Is that consent is the sort of privilege that's happening when we have play and erotics. And I think that play is not always consensual. I think that that is a thing that is important. And so to understand like the scope of that context, we have to understand the ways that consent is a privilege for people to have. It's an important thing, of course, but it's just something that not everybody has access to. And as we think through what's happening with these erotics of domination and the violence of these erotics of domination, sometimes they're consensual mechanics. I don't know what the conversation on consent between person and machine is, but I think that's a conversation to think about, because, as we interact with like a sex game, like Bo was showing, it invokes a very different kind of relationship than, or actually the same relationship as when we interact with each other. And it trains us to think about things in these, I think, problematic ways. So I don't know, I'm always like the voice of dialogism in these conversations. That's not my personality, but that is how I feel about that in theory.
That reminds me, even at like a more basic level, like I was thinking, Bo, when you were speaking, if people have seen like some of the interviews with, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the auteur behind the Dark Souls game, right? But people are always like, oh, this guy is such a sadist. And he's like, no, I'm a masochist. I make these games because I want to be like punished by them. I love the punishing difficulty. But then that, like, there is a question of access there as well, right? Because we have these whole discourses about difficulty in games and the fact that for a host of reasons, any given person might not be able to pick up one of those games and get that masochistic pleasure out of it, right? I think that's really, really interesting. There's another question from the audience that I'll bring in from Christine. Amazing talks, everyone. Agreed. In your research experience, are there any playful practices and or ludic texts that cannot be recuperated by heuristic of pleasure? Or if that's too totalitarian a question, what problematic pleasures for you have been most challenging to approach through reparative reading? I think that's a really interesting question.
I'll give that a shot, and I'll also kind of respond to the earlier question a bit, which is I think this, for me, a lot of the thoughts about kink and consent in games and the kind of racial play that can go on, and racial play, I'm thinking of like kink communities that do talk about race, right, and use that as a kind of erotic motive in communities of color, I should say. And so like to think about how that can or doesn't happen in games is part of what led me to thinking about the Asiatic and how like certain game genres especially can have like playfully like erotic but also like hurtful effects, right? They can bring a kind of pain, but because they're obscured in a kind of Asiatic bizarreness, that the person who feels that can presume that it has something to do with its like distancing, right? That it's blurred in a way that like maybe this is part of the translation, right? Maybe this is just something that I'm misreading about it, or maybe it's like, oh, we just know that these games do that, right? And so it has that, again, that kind of distancing to it. I think it is difficult to then get out of those kind of measurements, but I did feel like for me that the ways that the problems that emerge out of the dynamics of pleasure and the erotics of like trying to take the entire scene into account, right? And that would then necessitate a bit more work or like thought on imperial histories, right, that are in the background of a lot of these projects. I think there's a lot of things that are emerging that have pleasure in them, but are actually much more about transformation. And I'm thinking of like Mika Cardenas's work. I mentioned Legacy Russell as well before. Some of Bo's work, of course, and there's a lot going on, I think, in considering the transformative effects and questioning it as well, right, of games and being. And I've noticed that this has become somewhat responsive to a different kind of wider context, which is, the kind of TERF feminism, and I was just like listening to this I didn't even know that she had this point of view, but Nina Power, who has a new book out, that basically just argues that that all the young folks who are trans these days are just playing too many video games, right? And they take so much pleasure out of being these other people, and that they're so, and she says things like that this is a completely new, right? That in other cultures, they don't have this thing called gender, right? There's no language for gender in other languages. It's completely ridiculous, but it was interesting to be like, well, so now they're thinking about video games as the kind of conduit, you know, to trans being, and somehow, of course, erasing all the history and imperial kind of domination that's erased those populations and those cultures. But at the same time, it's like I feel that conversation is out there now, and is where a lot of it's at. And I feel like pleasure is a bit more taking a back seat or being less emphasized, because it kind of presumes a different kind of dynamic, I guess, that doesn't quite, is important but isn't quite as centralized, right? In narratives of transformation, where it's like I am becoming this thing, and not necessarily out of pleasure, right? It's not necessarily because of one's pleasure. And I think trying to distance from that is taking a bit more of a center stage role, at least for me, in a lot of work.
Thanks. And any other panelists have any thoughts on this question of like the limits of reparative reading and like the pleasures that are too problematic to you know, capture in or reorient?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Christine. That's such a good one. So I think this is maybe an example of this. I have been working on a piece recently about Kaiwa and about man-playing games, which is, you know, that as you all know, this has been taken up as this really classic game studies text. So of course it predates game studies, and it is, you know, to tie to Chris's work, like amazingly problematic in terms of its representation of non-white peoples. And Erin, this came up in your talk as well. So this text that like, I don't think we should reclaim or repair, but what I'm interested in is finding the queer elements in it. So it has been used by so many later game studies scholars to tell us what play is, tell us what games can be, and to give a kind of like legitimate historical founding to the study of games, but in this way that is very straight and very desexualized. But if we look back to the original text, it is all about pleasure. Like literally, it's so much about pleasure, and not just pleasure in a kind of light touch way, but like in that very French, like jouissance, like orgasm kind of pleasure. And so it's a super queer text from some perspectives. But so what's been challenging for me in doing that work is to say, look at the queer elements, but I'm not trying to reclaim it. And I'm not trying to reclaim the history of game studies as a canon. What I'm trying to do is show you what is messed up about game studies, that we've claimed Kaiwa's text as part of a straight history and erased all the queer elements from it. So I found myself trying to walk that very kind of tightrope.
That's super interesting. Kaiwa also was very interested in human sacrifice, right? He was part of a group that just really wanted to do an actual human sacrifice, but no one would volunteer from the group to do it. So lots to unpack there. Scott, Sarah, do you have any questions you want to throw out to our panelists before we wrap up?
Yeah. Oh, can you hear my sound all right? My headphones are dying, and so I'm okay. Great. So I've been thinking, this came up for me in Erin's talk especially, but I think it runs through everybody's, that I've been thinking about a couple of tactics that the game scholars or sort of game adjacent scholars have used to try to rescue play from games that are bad. So I'm thinking about David Golumbia's Games Without Play, where it's like the game is bad, but play is good. And that what we do when we approach software objects isn't really play, because if it were, then it would be a site for freedom. Or I'm thinking about metagaming, where it's like the play is not actually the thing that we do with the software object, it's the social relation of the software object engenders. And so I'm just wondering, I tend to mistrust, especially in the Golumbia sense, that like you're not really playing. Oh, like the way you have to like put that really in there, it feels like it's too tidy an argument. But I feel like I also, and there's been a lot of stuff about like not wanting to throw away pleasure as an analytic category. And so I'm just wondering, what you make of those those sort of operations that try to rescue play almost unproblematically by like severing it from the software object that we all think is bad.
I don't think we should do that. I actually find that there could be more generative conversations if we leave them tangled, if we leave them attached to their problematic origins and foundations. Because and I understand that. Like I'm not, trying to like dismiss that, because I understand the urge in which we can do that. And I think that's what a lot of us do in order to still derive pleasure from a lot of these things that are very problematic, right? We detach them, from their problematic origins. But I think that those things can still like exist, and I think that's where like a lot of the necessary conversations and the growth and the understanding can then happen. So I'm just even thinking about how wild that example was that you just gave about this person who was like, yeah, they did all this and that, and by the way, they wanted to do human sacrifice. I'm like, I'm even more fascinated by that. Keep even the complex problematic ones, keep them intact and whole, so we can understand the full nuances around them.
Yeah, I love that question also. I think it's really important. My instinct with that is to say exactly what Kishona said, which is that these conversations are really important. But then Kishona, you said something else, which was that it's important that they're messy. And I think that navigating pleasure, this is like a thing to really keep in the back of my mind, is that this is going to be messy, right? Like I'm going to be the imperfect me that I've always been. And I actually think that's important because, purity is as a sort of binary opposition to messy, right? Like that is problematic. Like that's eugenics, right? Like that's where these sort of like real axes of repression lie. And so I don't know, I guess I'm suspicious of theorizations that try to make things tidy and try to put things in one place and keep things together.
Well, it's been a messy panel. Timekeeping was a little messy. So we are going to wrap. There's so much more to say and so much more to talk about. And I do hope that these conversations continue in one form or another. There are many great questions in the Q&A function, which I will copy and share with the panelists, although we will not have time to get to all of them, unfortunately. I'm just going to real briefly share this one more time so that I can say a few thank yous on behalf of my co-organizers. I want to extend a huge thank you to all of our panelists for joining us. Super appreciate it. It's been an absolutely unproblematic pleasure to speak with you today. I also would like to thank the Jackman Humanities Institute for making this event possible, making it part of their 2021-2022 program for the arts, and St. Michael's College, the Knowledge Media Design Institute, the Faculty of Information and Cinema Studies Institute for their additional support. Also want to shout out Natalie Barbuzzi from the St. Mike's Principal's Office, who provided valuable tech support, and Kenji Toyuka, who designed the fantastic event logo that you can see on your screens. Once again, I'm very much in love with this logo. Lastly, thank you to everyone for joining us for this event. I hope it has been as generative for you as it was for us. And the very last thing that I want to do is I do want to shout out another event that will touch on similar themes of problematic pleasures that I'm not involved in organizing this one. I am just really looking forward to attending it. It's called Hot Tub Streams and Wet Media Dreams. It also features Bo along with Christine H. Tran, Christopher Persaud, Ariana Gass, and Amanda Cullen, talking about some similar themes around the technopolitics of sex in live streaming media, among other things. And you can register for that at tinyurl.com/sexsalon2022. So long, everyone. Have a great weekend.